1. At 12, my mother found a fatal flaw in a jet's hydraulics and refused takeoff clearance. Richard Blackwood, Vanguard Aviation's billionaire owner, screamed in her face, accusing her of drama and threatening to replace her. She gripped the manifest, knuckles white, and stood her ground. By morning, she was framed for stealing aviation parts and blacklisted before noon. Disgraced and broke, she jumped from our apartment roof. Years later, fueled by spite and student loans, I fought my way into the National Aviation Academy. Graduating as the FAA's most ruthless airworthiness inspector, I now held Vanguard's $10 billion fleet expansion on my desk. Test data was perfect, the board ready to sign. Only my pen was missing. I opened the dossier. Under software supplier, the parent company was Vanguard Tech CEO, Richard Blackwood. I closed the file, picked up my pen, and wrote my verdict. Approval denied. Fleet grounded indefinitely. The atmosphere in the conference room was suffocating. The entire inspection board was present. A row of Vanguard Aviation executives sat in the gallery, barely hiding the smug anticipation on their faces. This certificate meant their massive $10 billion investment was finally hitting the global market. All the preliminary data was perfect. Every single subcategory had the bright red stamp of approval. It all came down to this final hurdle: the lead inspector's signature. Every eye in the room was locked onto me. I flipped to the second to last page of the thick binder and let my eyes linger on the text. Vanguard Tech. Legal representative, Richard Blackwood. My fingers tightened around the barrel of my pen. When I was 12, my mother, Eleanor, was a senior quality control engineer at Vanguard Aviation. She was meticulous. She obsessed over every single valve and wire. One night, she noticed an abnormal pressure fluctuation in the hydraulic system. After running the math 3 times, she concluded it was a catastrophic risk. She locked the system and refused to sign the release manifest. She truly believed she was saving lives. But all Richard Blackwood saw was a delayed departure. He only saw the massive penalty fees for a missed schedule. He only saw a disposable quality control worker daring to stand in the way of his cash flow. Stop using safety as an excuse to be dramatic. If you won't fly it, pack your bags and get the hell out. That was what he screamed at her. My mother held her ground. She kept the manifest and refused to back down. The next day, there was no safety investigation. Instead, a termination notice arrived, accusing her of embezzling high-grade titanium parts. An 8-year veteran of the industry, completely blacklisted overnight. I still remember that final evening. She washed my school uniform, hung it up to dry by the window, and stood there staring up at the sky for a very long time. Sloan, I didn't do anything wrong. That was the last thing she ever said to me before she stepped off the roof. Over the years, Richard's airline empire grew into a global powerhouse, and I took out crippling loans to get through the academy. 4 years of undergrad, 3 years of graduate school, 2 years of brutal certification exams. I bled to climb into this exact chair. I had been waiting for this exact day. I closed the file. I pressed my pen to the paper and wrote my decision. Approval denied. Fleet grounded indefinitely. Inspector Sloan, what is the meaning of this? Arthur, the head of the review board, slammed his hands on the table and stood up. The flight data is perfect. The entire board voted to approve. On what grounds are you vetoing this? Marcus, the vice president of Vanguard Aviation, shot up from the gallery. Sloan, do you have any idea what you're doing? Do you know how much interest this company bleeds every single day this $10 billion project sits on the tarmac? Can you afford that kind of liability? I calmly opened my folder and pulled out the inquiry sheet I had prepared hours ago. The flight control software source code validation report is missing 3 critical parameter logs. Furthermore, Vanguard Tech's vendor certification expired last month and has not been renewed. I looked directly at Marcus. According to Agency Regulation Part 21, Incomplete documentation mandates an automatic denial. I asked the lead inspector. I have absolute veto power. This is entirely lawful and compliant. Arthur's face turned purple. These are clerical trivialities. It is just a matter of filing a late addendum. You are grounding the entire fleet over a paperwork delay. Incomplete is incomplete. There are no trivialities when it comes to aviation safety. I pushed my chair back and stood up. If you have an objection, file for an administrative review. Until that review concludes, the aircraft remains grounded. I turned and walked out of the room without a single backward glance. Behind the heavy oak doors, I could hear the muffled sounds of men cursing my name. 2. The next morning, I received an urgent summons to the agency's VIP reception lounge. I pushed the door open. Richard Blackwood was sitting comfortably on the leather sofa. Director Mitchell, the head of our entire division, was sitting right next to him, playing the gracious host. Seeing me enter, Richard stood up and adjusted his expensive suit. Inspector Sloan, I have heard incredible things about you. He wore a practiced, media-ready smile, but when he reached out to shake my hand, his fingers barely grazed mine before pulling away quickly. Like he was touching something filthy. Mr. Blackwood, I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat. Inspector Sloan is young, brilliant, and the absolute backbone of this agency, Mitchell chimed in, laughing nervously. Richard kept smiling, but his eyes were scanning me top to bottom, calculating my worth. He didn't recognize me. How could he? When I was 12, I threw myself onto the marble floor of the Vanguard Aviation lobby and wrapped my arms around his legs. I begged him to retract the firing. I begged him to clear my mother's name. He didn't even bother to look down at me. Security dragged this trash out into the street. He was a god in his own mind. Why would he ever remember the face of an ant he crushed under his heel? Richard sat back down and pulled a thick, pristine envelope from his breast pocket. Inspector Sloan, I understand you relied heavily on student loans to finance your impressive education. I also hear you are currently living in cramped public housing. His tone was dripping with manufactured sympathy. Vanguard Aviation recently established a Young Talent Foundation. We specifically sponsor brilliant young professionals who come from difficult backgrounds. He slid the envelope across the glass table. I could clearly see the check inside. $5 million. Consider it a private grant from Vanguard to support the future of aviation. He leaned forward, dropping the corporate speak. Look, we all know this inspection is just a formality. The missing files are basically typos. We will patch them up next week. There is no need to be so rigid. You sign that paper today, and this money goes straight into your personal account, and no one will ever know. He didn't even care that the director of the agency was sitting 2 feet away. I reached out and pushed the envelope right back across the glass. Mr. Blackwood, the documentation is incomplete. I cannot sign. Richard's smile twitched. Sloan, listen to me. You are barely in your 30s, and you're already a lead inspector. The sky is the limit for you. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. I have already spoken with the upper management. If you just play ball on this one project, Vanguard will personally endorse your promotion to department chief. He tapped the envelope. You had a rough start in life. You swallowed a lot of glass to get to this chair. Do not throw your entire future away over a minor bureaucratic technicality. The corners of his mouth curled up just a fraction. It was a look of absolute, arrogant pity. He was silently telling me, people like you are incredibly lucky just to be allowed in the building. Don't bite the hand that feeds you. Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate the generous offer, but until those files are submitted in full, my pen stays in my pocket. Richard's smile vanished. The polite, wealthy gentleman routine evaporated instantly. His eyes turned dead, cold, and full of raw contempt. It was the exact same look I saw when I was on my knees in his lobby 20 years ago. Sloan, when I throw you a bone, you take it. He stood up, towering over the coffee table. You really think a low-level paper pusher can hold my empire hostage? I have survived storms that would drown you in a second. If you refuse to sign that certificate today, I will personally guarantee you never work in this industry again. He buttoned his suit jacket. You just wait. I looked right back into his dead eyes. No anger, no fear, not a single flinch. I had been waiting for this day for nearly 2 decades. You want me to wait? Richard Blackwood, I am the one who has been waiting for you. 3. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, I was summoned to Director Mitchell's private office. Marcus, Vanguard's vice president, was already sitting on the sofa. 20 years ago, Marcus was the director of maintenance. He was the man who wrote, reviewed, hold for now, on my mother's critical safety warning. Mitchell stood by the window, staring out at the runway, completely silent. Marcus glared at me. Inspector Sloan, have you bothered to run the math on the daily interest for a $10 billion loan? You are not hurting Mr. Blackwood. You are holding a knife to the throats of 20,000 Vanguard employees who need this launch to feed their families. If this company goes under, can you carry that kind of blood on your hands? I didn't blink. Marcus, the paperwork is missing. When it is complete, I will sign. It is that simple. Sloan, you are young, Marcus sneered, the threat bleeding through his teeth. Think very carefully about your career trajectory. It would be a real tragedy if you were permanently stripped of your inspection credentials. I suggest you wise up. Mr. Blackwood's patience is entirely gone. He stood up, straightened his tie, and walked toward the door. As he passed me, he patted me hard on the shoulder. A physical reminder to know my place. Once the door clicked shut, it was just me and Mitchell. Sloan. He sighed, sounding like a disappointed father. The agency recognizes your technical brilliance. Truly. But in this line of work, you cannot just look at the code. You have to look at the big picture. The mayor's office is heavily invested in this Vanguard project. He paused, letting the political weight sink in. Can we not show a little flexibility on these minor procedural hiccups? Just draft a conditional approval letter. Let them promise to submit the code later. As long as the optics are fine, there is no need to enforce the letter of the law so brutally. You have a long career ahead of you. Being the stubborn, it does not end well for anyone. Every word he spoke was legally safe, but every single syllable was an order to surrender. My voice was like ice. If it is missing one single page, I will not sign. Tell them to submit the code. Mitchell looked at me, his face hardening. Think about this, Sloan. I turned and walked out. The very next morning, a mass agency memo hit every inbox. To optimize our review mechanisms and expedite critical airworthiness projects, the administration has restructured the Oversight Committee. Inspector Sloan is hereby removed from the position of lead inspector. All final approvals will be handled directly by the Executive Review Board. I was boxed up and banished to the basement archives. At 10 in the morning, I carried a cardboard box into the dusty archive room. A few clerks watched me, whispering behind their hands. No one stepped up to defend me. Committing career suicide by crossing Vanguard Aviation was not contagious. Down the hallway, Mitchell walked toward me. As we passed each other, he didn't even stop walking. He just muttered under his breath. Think it through, Sloan. I knew exactly what he meant. Grovel now, and you might get your desk back. I adjusted my grip on my cardboard box and kept walking. That afternoon, Brenda from Human Resources came down to the basement to check on me. Sloan, what exactly is your endgame here? The entire board approved the Vanguard project. You were the only one playing hero. Now look at you, stripped of your title, rotting down here with the mold. Do you regret it yet? I looked up from the stack of old boxes. It isn't over yet. Brenda froze. She walked to the door, turned around and looked at me like I belonged in a psych ward. Once she was gone, I opened my laptop and pulled up the encrypted review logs. She was right. It wasn't over. The trap was just beginning to close. That evening, an old college friend sent me a link. "Sloan, what the hell is going on?" I clicked the link. It was a massive investigative article by a prominent aviation blogger. Headline: "The strictest inspector or the most corrupt." A deep dive into Sloan's dictatorship at the aviation agency. The test flights were flawless. The entire board voted yes. Only Inspector Sloan vetoed the project. Are we looking at a blatant shakedown for bribes? According to anonymous insiders, Sloan frequently hints that airlines need to provide supplemental materials. What exactly she wants them to supplement is anyone's guess. The comment section was an absolute bloodbath. How is this corrupt witch still employed? Investigate her bank accounts immediately. Holding a $10 billion project hostage all by herself? If you think she isn't fishing for a payout, you are delusional. There were dozens of hit pieces multiplying by the hour. Another headline screamed, "Delaying the billion-dollar launch, heroic standards or petty revenge?" This one dug into my personal life. It listed my student loans, my single-parent household, the fact that my mother died young and in disgrace. The implication was dripping from every paragraph. A desperate, poor girl climbs into a seat of massive power. Put $10 billion in front of her, and of course she's going to hold her hand out for a cut. I clenched my jaw and turned off my phone. 1 week later, the heavy metal door of the archive room creaked open. A junior admin assistant stood there, looking incredibly uncomfortable. Sloan, the airworthiness certificate was officially signed by the executive board. Vanguard rented out the entire Continental Hotel. They're doing a global live broadcast of the maiden flight at 2 o'clock. Mr. Blackwood is personally boarding the plane for the test run. I turned the page of the dusty manifest in my hands. Got it. At 1:30 in the afternoon, I drove to the tarmac. The agency had mandated that all review personnel be present for the historic launch. The tarmac was a sea of people. Vanguard executives, city politicians, Wall Street investors, and dozens of media cameras were all aimed at the massive, gleaming silver jet. Richard Blackwood stood at the center of the press podium, soaking in the glory. Today marks a historic turning point for Vanguard Aviation. This aircraft represents the absolute pinnacle of global aviation technology. IT has passed the most rigorous safety inspections on Earth. In a few moments, I will personally board this flight to prove that Vanguard stands behind its quality. The crowd erupted into deafening applause. I stood at the very back of the crowd, my face entirely blank. Richard walked up the boarding stairs, turning at the top to give a victorious wave to the cameras. Then he stepped inside the cabin. The entire tarmac held its collective breath, waiting for the roar of the engines. 1 second. 2 seconds. 5 seconds. Through the cockpit glass, a row of green indicators blinked once. And then, every single warning light flashed a blinding, violent red. System diagnostic failed. Hydraulic valves, safety lock engaged. Engine ignition disabled. The global live feed kept rolling. The $10 billion marvel of engineering sat dead on the runway, completely unresponsive. Panic rippled through the media pit. Through the window, Richard's face came into view. The arrogant smile was gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated panic as he stared at the sea of red warning screens. The crowd broke into chaotic murmurs. 10 agonizing minutes later, Richard walked out of the cabin. His face was a mask of pure, murderous rage. He marched down the stairs, his eyes scanning the crowd like a predator. They locked right onto me. I knew that exact look. It was the look he gave my mother 20 years ago. The day he screamed at her face while she clung to that safety report. The very next day, she became a thief and a pariah. And now he was aiming that exact same weapon at me. Right on cue, Richard stormed through the crowd, heading straight for me. The cameras pivoted instantly, tracking his every move. He stopped 2 feet away from me. Sloan, just because I refuse to pay your extortion fee, you think you can sabotage a commercial airliner? You are destroying the livelihoods of thousands of innocent people. In one breath, he crucified me. He told the entire world I had tampered with the plane because he wouldn't pay my bribe. The journalist started whispering frantically. Did she hack the plane? Can't an inspector even lock down the flight systems? That is actual terrorism. Director Mitchell materialized at my side, playing the devastated leader perfectly. Sloan, if what Mr. Blackwood is saying is true, do you have any idea what you have done? Thousands of jobs. $10 billion. Can you survive the consequences of this? He sounded like a man pleading with a criminal to surrender. Every word was designed to pile the guilt squarely on my shoulders. The camera crews surged forward, shoving microphones in my face. Inspector Sloan, did you tamper with the flight control system? How do you justify holding a $10 billion project hostage? I could only imagine the live chat on the broadcast feed. This chick is psychotic. Lock her up. Even if she didn't hack it, abusing her power like this is disgusting. Investigate her bank accounts. She is a menace. She ruined thousands of lives just to throw a tantrum. Richard looked at me with deep, theatrical sorrow. Inspector Sloan, what could you possibly say to defend yourself now? He had dragged me into the town square to be executed. He wanted me to be the villain, the criminal. Just like he made my mother the thief. I looked at the blinding flashes of the cameras. I looked at the angry faces of the crowd. I looked at Richard's towering, arrogant stance. And then I smiled. The entire crowd went dead silent. I took one deliberate step forward. Mr. Blackwood, do you want to know exactly why I am doing this? My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence like a scalpel. 20 years ago, a quality control engineer named Eleanor discovered a fatal anomaly in the hydraulic systems. She refused to sign the release manifest. The very next day, she was framed for stealing titanium parts and permanently blacklisted from the aviation industry. She was my mother. I was 13 years old when the shame drove her off the roof of a building. Richard's pupils dilated in raw shock. I stared him down. You used your power to frame my mother and push her to her death. And today, you thought you could use the exact same playbook to dump your toxic waste onto me. But this time, you won't win.